Okay, welcome. We are live. This is Jerry's take on China's first ever video interview with a very, very friendly face, Robbie Barwick. And first of all, Robbie, welcome to my show, which is very unusual for me to say that. And the reason I wanted to invite you on, apart from the fact that you are a very friendly and well-known Australian, is because you invited me onto your show when I was almost an unknown. Nobody knew who I was. And you contacted me and said, hey, we'd like to talk to you on the show about China. And it was a nice gesture on your part. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, this is my first video interview. I'd like someone who helped me to get to I wouldn't say I'm a degree of fame, but to get to the position where I am now. It was a few stepping stones. Nobody had heard of me 2 years ago. And now suddenly a lot of people know who I am. Some of them don't like me. Some of them think I'm doing the right thing. But Robbie, welcome to my show. Thank you for helping me to get to where I got. And would you like to give the viewers a little bit of an introduction to yourself?
Well, thank you for having me on, Jerry. And it was a pleasure having you on our show 2 years ago. I took notice of you on Twitter, this Australian Brit riding his bike around China. And I'm thinking, well, I know I'm hearing all these accusations about China. And here's someone who's there and has had all this incredible access. Let's get your version of it. So that was really important. You were one of my first interviews actually on our.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. You were so professional. I had no idea.
The first 3 or 4 that year, which was very, very effective. So that was great. The Citizens Party, I'm the research director of a political party here, the Citizens Party. And we're very successful in our own way, but that's not so much at election time. We work on that though. What we were successful in organising the public around policy campaigns to influence the government in either stopping what we consider bad legislation or promoting, good policy solutions. So, for instance, our campaign at the moment, our main campaign is for a postal bank. All the private banks are shutting down their branches. And a lot of countries like China, like Japan, have post office banks, government banks operating through post offices. And this is something that can fill a void. So we're campaigning for that. And in doing so, we get a lot of support. But one of the reasons we sometimes don't do as well at elections is because we don't sacrifice our principles, and we are prepared to take unpopular positions if we think that the principle is right. And in recent times, our most unpopular position has been the only political party in Australia speaking out against and pushing back against the demonization of China, because we're not buying it for a second. What we don't accept is the credibility of the people making the accusations, Jerry, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about that. So we have taken, and it's really tragic. You said you haven't been here lived here for 18 years.
Yeah,
we're a country that benefits immensely from our trade relationship with China. I mean, we are probably the single biggest beneficiary per capita. It's enormous, our trade relationship with China. It's all in our favor almost. In terms of the income, at least, I would argue from a true economic standpoint that that the iron ore and stuff that China buys from us is more in its favor because it gets to use it. We should be using it here.
Yeah, I've often thought the same. And there's been a couple of people actually come out and say we need to use this iron ore and create steel and sell steel, or create products and sell products, and it's not happening.
No, exactly. So that's the sort of thing. That's the sort of thing our party, from an economic standpoint, really endorses. So yeah.
Is there anything that people don't know about your party that they should know?
Oh dear. Well, we're a party with a focus on the common good of our country, but we do have an international focus. We're not internationalists. We firmly believe that every country should have its own sovereignty, and that sovereignty should be respected. But we do believe that countries should cooperate together. And this is, as a party, we have associations with like-minded groups around the world. The most well-known one is the Schiller Institute, which is headed by Helga Zepp LaRouche, the wife of a late economist, Lyndon LaRouche. And so we've had a very good association with them over many, many years, decades, in fact. And it does make us unique, because without that, we would be a rather insular, inward-looking party, which doesn't have a perspective that can explain how events come about. Because I'll just say this, one of my big discoveries in politics, Jerry, was to discover that the domestic issues that I was concerned about were not unique to Australia. Every country tends to deal with these sort of things at the same time, both on foreign policy, both on economics, those sort of things, right? And so when you see it, when you have an international perspective, look at the whole world as a whole, and you go, oh, that's what's happening. You see more of the causes, you get the clarity on that. Plus, you get a different perspective on solutions and various approaches. Because, for instance, we've gone, if you just go by the Australian media, you would think that the decisions made in Washington and London rule the world. Well, they once did, but they no longer. The decisions made in Beijing and New Delhi are becoming much more significant.
Yes.
Than the decisions, especially the decisions made in some of those other places. So that gives Australians a different perspective, which we desperately need.
Okay, a little trick question here. Is Australia a European country or an Asian country?
Well, I think we can say proudly that we're both, but only if we put aside our chauvinism and genuinely acknowledge the good in both, and the need to incorporate the good in both. Yeah. There is a current in Australia that tends to think that Western civilization is superior, and other cultures should assimilate to that. There is good in Western civilization, but Western civilization must also acknowledge that when you have a 5,000-year-old culture like the Chinese civilization, there is a lot of good.
There's a fair percentage of that population actually living in Australia too. Sure. And this is something, I think there's 500,000 Chinese ethnicity people inside of Australia who identify as Australians. And that's great that they do, but there's a lot of people.
Not 500,000, 1.5 million.
1.5 million in Sydney.
Yeah.
As many as that? Oh, wow. Okay, I thought it was just 500,000 in Sydney. So 1.5 million in the city of Sydney identify as Chinese. Wow. So
no, sorry that we got that wrong. So I thought you were saying Australia. No, in the city of Sydney, it's more like 1.5 million across the country.
Okay, right. That makes sense. That makes more sense now. But yeah, so we've got that huge amount of people that are considered by this group of people that you're talking about there. They're considered to be of a less civilized nature than the Australians. What would you say to those people?
Well, they're not. Like, if I'm talking to the Australian Chinese, they're definitely not. And when I talk to my fellow Australians, I try and get them to reflect on this, because most politicians would not acknowledge that, but implicit in their behaviour, that is the case. And it's also implicit in the nature of the disinformation that is circulated about China and the allegations at China. I'll just give you one. This is when I get on my show, and I tend to get a bit angry even thinking about this, because I understand how destructive it can be. But one allegation that has been thrown up a lot in the last few years, that the average person will hit me with, is, what about the live organ harvesting? And the thing is, implicit in that, what they believe, which is totally untrue, is they accept a caricaturish version of the Chinese as actual monsters. These are not really people. These are monsters. These are monsters that are prepared to do the most inhumane things that they can possibly imagine. And that is completely unfair, but it is built on 150 years, Jerry, of a yellow peril incitement of fear that has gripped Australia. And it sometimes it's lesser, sometimes it's more. We're in a period where it's more, and it's it's very, very unfair, and it can be incited by political figures, by the media, and that's what our party is trying to combat. Because it's if you actually treat Chinese people the way you would want to be treated, right, the golden rule, you will see that they have the same humanity you do. They bleed the same color blood you do. They care about your kids, their kids, the way you do, etc. They have the same concerns as unites all humanity.
Yeah, that's that same kind of stigma that we give Western people give to Asian people is what created the ability in some people's mind to drop a bomb on Nagasaki or Hiroshima. How can you draw yourself into that position where you say this bomb is going to kill millions of people, potentially over the next 30, 40, 50 years, it's going to cause problems. And yet you still do it. The only way you could do that is if these are not humans, that you're not dropping a bomb on humans, you're dropping a bomb on something that you despise. And that's where we're leading to. Yeah.
Unfortunately, when you're at the end of a war like World War II, then the goodwill is well and truly trashed, right? And that's easy to do. It's one of the reasons I'm concerned about making sure that all this rhetoric of war now doesn't turn into a war. Because when you're in
imagine how I feel living in Guangdong.
Yeah.
we're number one target when that happens, if that happens. Let's move on from that. There's a couple of things that I wanted to talk to you about today. One of them was, I know that you've never spent much time in China, but you have been here, right? You've been to China.
Well, my claim to fame is Guangzhou Airport on the way to Europe and on the way back. Few hours each time. That's it. And I don't mind saying that. I feel disappointed that I haven't been to China, but by the same token, I don't mind admitting that's all I have, because a lot of people accuse me of somehow being a Chinese agent now on the Chinese government's payroll, and I have no connections at all to China.
Like they approached you at the airport and told you, we want you to sell your soul to us. Yeah.
I wish they'd approached me at the airport to help me get through the customs process quicker that night, because we were tired and my kids were vomiting on the floor. They were motion sick. Anyway, we got no favors at all.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, at what stage? I mean, knowing that you don't know China like I know China, I know Australia and China and the UK probably equally as well. Probably China is best now because I haven't left it for the last 3 years almost. But what stage did you realize that what you were reading about China was not the real China? How did that manifest itself in your mind?
Okay, well, there's two parts to that, to answer that question. One is, as a political movement with an international focus, our party, I mean, I remember when I first joined the party in 1992, I never questioned claims made about China. I remember having discussions with people about how terrible Tiananmen Square must have been, etc. Right? This was just all accepted. But then, from the mid 1990s, 1996 especially onwards, our party worked with our fellow thinkers around the world to promote positive economic policies, and one of those came out of a major conference in China that Helga Zepp-LaRouche had attended on the Eurasian land bridge, and the whole idea of developing the old Silk Road into an infrastructure corridor to unite the East and West. And these are the sort of policies that our party champions. We want that sort of infrastructure for Australia as well. And so we have looked at China economically with great positivity for 25 years. And then when you have that perspective that what's happening in China economically is positive, then you realize straight away a lot of what's being said can't be true, because a government that is so intent on improving the lives of its citizens, by definition, cannot be evil, right? Yeah. It's got to the point where I say to people, look how evil the Chinese government is. It does so much good stuff to hide how evil it is. Yes. Well, if you're that evil, well, you have to do only good stuff to hide it. At a certain point, you become good. And so,
I've had that same argument where people say to me, "Yeah, they only do that to win popularity." Yes.
That's what a good government does.
Yeah,
That's the first part of the answer. And so for that reason, I'm not assuming China's perfect, but I've never been convinced, because you know what, Jerry, over the same period, and I can't remember when you told me that you came to Australia, but it was in the 90s.
87, I arrived in Australia.
87. Okay.
Yeah, 87 to 2004 Australia was my home.
Right. So in that same period, I can show you the economic statistics that we follow about Australia, where our country has gone backwards. So we've gone backwards. Our living standard has suffered, but the people of China have gone forwards, and their living standard has improved. And that is unequivocal. The second part, though, and this was the defining episode in my life and many, many people's lives. The second part was the Iraq War, because what we got to see in the Iraq War was our side, our governments, our allies deliberately, not mistaken intelligence, deliberately fabricating lies to orchestrate a war that has killed up to 1 million people.
Do you believe that Australia fabricated the evidence, or were provided with fabricated information to form the opinion?
No. I tell you, I don't have hardcore evidence, but I'll tell you one. There were two people in the world who were willing to speak the most blatant lie, and the most blatant lie of all was the claim that Saddam Hussein somehow was connected to Al Qaeda. And the reason why that was the most blatant lie is because everybody who knew the story of Al Qaeda knew that Al Qaeda, its whole history, had two bitter enemies: Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. Right? They had no truck with Al Qaeda ever. They were implacable enemies of Al Qaeda, and this was a totally lame lie to try and just sow a general seed in people's minds that somehow Saddam might have had something to do with 9/11. And if you know the story, when they took opinion polls of Americans, most Americans assumed that somehow Iraq was involved with 9/11, right? Two people who spoke that lie was someone who I regard as one of the most evil men who's ever lived, Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States, and the Prime Minister of Australia, John Winston Howard.
Okay.
John Howard is not a dumb person. He's a very intelligent person. He's a very careful person. For him to be willing to repeat something that was so clearly untrue makes me very suspicious that he was willing to be part of a general propaganda campaign at the time, because it's so valuable in America to be able to say, oh, the Prime Minister of Australia has said, right?
Yeah.
And then it's used to further the propaganda cause.
Yeah.
And that's I have grave suspicions about that. I do not cut our government any slack. They're not going to get away with me saying, oh, it was just mistaken intelligence.
It wasn't a mistake. Okay. My view has always been, and I've got no reason to doubt what you say at all, no reason at all. But my view has always been that other governments were fed the wrong information. And I do know that the British were part of fabricating that wrong information. They have this expression that they sexed up the dossier so that it read better than it needed to read, worse than it needed to read in order to. Someone's made the comment about Falun Gong, and you talked about organ harvesting a little while ago, and I thought that might be interesting to come back to that. I actually know the history of this. If a person in China was executed, they automatically organ harvested them after the execution. And the United Nations and the human rights people said, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. And so one of the things that did change, and it changed about 20 years ago, was they stopped doing that without permission. So they only do that now with the authority. Now, how they get that authority, you're going to be executed, sign this, or I don't know what the threat is, but do you want to be an organ donor after you're executed? Do something good for society. Now, the fact was they did used to organ harvest executed prisoners' organs. And I happen to know the recipient of one of those. So this is how I know that does happen. I went to visit a friend of mine, a teacher colleague who was in hospital, and she was going to die without a new liver, I think it was. And she said to me, "I'm going to get a new liver next Tuesday." And I said, "How does that happen? They can't say next Tuesday." And she said, "Oh, it's a criminal." Oh, I didn't know about that. So that was how I learned about that. That was 2005, 2006. It was a long time ago. And they did change the law on that. But Falun Gong have now got this thing that they'll get arrested. Now, I have yet to meet any person who has lost a liver, lost a kidney, lost a heart. Well, of course, you're not going to meet that person. But they say that they're live organ harvesting and then releasing them. Come on. If that were true, there would be witnesses, and there aren't any. So Falun Gong are the people who put this out there, and their newspaper, which a lot of people don't realize is connected, and I think we probably should talk about this, is the Epoch Times. Epoch Times has got nothing to do with reality. It's all about what Falun Gong wants people to believe about China.
I regard it very dismally. My first taste of it was a few months into the pandemic in 2020, when people were hitting me with this claim that 20 million people in China, in Hubei province, had died from COVID, because Epoch Times published an article saying that 20 million mobile phone accounts had been turned off.
Yeah, I remember that.
I'm thinking, this is insane, because I was pointing out to these same people, if this virus is so, I mean, we know it's not good, it's a deadly virus, especially with comorbidities, but if it's that deadly, that there's 20 million dead, that means 20 million dead in Hubei means there's 10 million dead on the coast, that means there's 5 million dead, that means that every second person you know in Sydney is dead. Give us a break, right?
Yeah.
Use your logic. But then I looked into, there's some Australians, independently of this whole picture, who are part of Falun Gong, who have recently written exposés of how the organization worked. And it's very, very enlightening. Even ABC did a series on it, Jerry.
I saw that. Yeah.
It's very enlightening, especially when you understand. I think the main thing I've taken to pointing out, because of the claims that I've tended to react to related to the pandemic, the main thing I've taken to pointing out is that, okay, you're taking claims from an organization led by a cult, which actually does not believe in medical science. It thinks doctors doing operations are aliens trying to infiltrate our bodies. And are you going to take those beliefs seriously? And of course you're not. And so if you're not going to take those beliefs seriously, why would you accept as normal media evidence what their media outlets say? The
way I view the Falun Gong movement, and someone's asking the question, Falun Gong, Falun Dafa, are they the same thing? Yes, there's been a slight name change because of the Falun Gong has become this evil, bad PR, basically. So they've changed their name, Falun Dafa. Effectively, the leader of Falun Gong is going to die one day, but his immortality is what keeps the cult alive. The day that he dies, I think the people in the cult are going to go, he's supposed to be immortal.
Yeah.
What was I believing in? But then, of course, in their own mind, it'll be something like, well, yeah, he's dead, but his spirit lives on through this child. And there'll be another Mr. Lee. I can't remember his name, but anyway, let's move on.
Sorry, one last thing. Last thing for the benefits of an Australian audience. My understanding is that, while there's claims that China cracked down on Falun Gong, my understanding from the words of these Australian ex-members is the way the organisation discourages people from getting medical treatment if they're sick would bring it to the attention of any authorities.
Yes.
Right? Because that can be very, very dangerous. And the scale, and naturally a country like China, which has less tolerance for this sort of thing, would move against it. And people need to look at what Falun Gong really is about before they make judgments about China.
Do you know why China has less tolerance for this kind of thing? It's historical. It goes back to the Taiping, the Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, the what they call the Mohammedan Rebellion. From 100, 150, 200 years ago, there were a series of different rebellions, all basically built up around a cult leader and religious rebellions. And so China now says, well, Article 36 says you can have freedom of religion. But Article 36 also says you cannot impose your religion on anybody else. So there are no missionaries in China anymore. There are priests. There are still Christians. There are still Muslims. Many millions of Muslims, and that's another topic we're not going to go to today. The Muslim. Oh yeah, I am going to ask you about the genocide, but that we'll come back to that later on. But yeah, this is why China is so strict about monitoring religion, because historically many millions of Chinese people have died as a result of some religious cult leaders. So they say, we're not going to have that. You can have anything you like in religion. Go to church, go to the mosque, go to I mean, there are temples on every street corner in China, pretty much. I'm going to one this morning. I'm in Beijing. This is a hotel room, by the way. So I'm meeting a friend and going to the oldest temple in Beijing. So there's religious freedom. There's no question about that. But this idea of having a cult that goes against the moral standards of a country, and that's what Falun Gong does, or has been doing. So that's why. Let's move on a little bit. I'm quite separated from daily life in Australia, but the trend that I'm seeing concerns me enormously. There's an increasing number of people who were once generally quite ambivalent about China. They didn't really care one way or another because China was just a big country in the north. But now I'm seeing hostility. And I'm wondering, as a person who lives, works, wanders around the streets in Australia, what are you seeing? Is it as bad as I am guessing just from the Twitter is not exactly a very stable platform for judging society. You do get some creeps on Twitter, but I have a lot of fun on Twitter, and I'm on Twitter quite a lot. And I'm getting people saying, yeah, but the Chinese are going to invade us, and the Chinese are a bunch of this and a bunch of that. And I'm a paid shill of the Chinese government, of course, like yourself. And I'd like to report back to my masters what the real feeling is. What do you think? What's the real feeling in the street? And the reason I asked this, I've got an American friend who went back to America. He said, no one gives a shit, if I can use that word. No one gives a shit about China in America. They've all got their own problems. They're not bothered about China. And yet everything we read in the news from America is how evil China is. But no one really cares in America. The American people in the street don't really care. Is that the same in Australia, or is there really tension there?
Well, I think by and large, the average person doesn't spend much time thinking about it. But when they do, it's that the prejudice has been incited in them, and it does come out. Most people would never act on it. You would have a situation in Australia, like at the height of the Islamophobia that accompanied the war on terror for 15 years before it suddenly switched into Sinophobia.
Yeah.
You will get the average redneck or bogan, who might take a pot shot at someone Chinese on a train, right, and say something rude and something intimidating. The other people around will probably push back and say, stop being rude. Because at a personal level, Australians don't like that. But it does happen. It is an issue. It does happen. There are Chinese people really do feel targeted, right? And they feel fearful. And when you do feel fearful, then small incidents get amplified as well, right?
Yeah.
The telltale is the way the politicians behave, because they are pandering to public opinion. And in their mind, public opinion has shifted drastically. Now, we've just done an article in our magazine on the Lowy Institute and how it influences foreign policy in Australia. And one of the things it does these polls on Australians, the attitude of Australians to China. And we have these polls influence the politicians, because I think this is what the public want. But we've shown that the question's very leading. So, for instance, one question in 2020 was, given the way the pandemic originated in China and then swept the world and everyone's dying and being locked down, etc., do you feel positive towards China?
What a great question.
And so the politicians don't bother to look at the details of the questions. They just see the end result. and they see, 80% of Australians are anti-China, 80% of Australians are suspicious about China, right?
Yeah.
That's after those sort of leading questions. That said, the percentage is much higher than it's ever been, because the disinformation, the attacks on China have absolutely worked. So I can't talk as I know, I can say two things. I know Australian Chinese feel fearful, and that's real, right? It's very disappointing, but they're the victims of it. I also know that from the standpoint of an average white guy, I'm not going to see much of it rubbed in people's faces, unless except in certain circumstances. Those circumstances are enough to intimidate people, right? So it's not everyone running and ducking for cover, but it's a bad enough problem. Everyone has taken. Sorry, one last thing on that. Everyone has taken a second look at this question, though, since the election, because it was clear from the election that the vote of the Australian Chinese community changed the outcome of the election, because the previous government had gone so hard in its Sinophobia, and the Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, had been hysterically talking up war with China, that the Chinese Australians, who are by and large mostly apolitical, don't really care. They're just here to get on with business, right? They just want normal lives. As one of them explained to me, he said all the Chinese aunties decided this government doesn't have a clue what it's talking about. We're going to vote for the other guys, and that was enough to change the outcome of the election. And that's taken people back a bit in a good way. It's like, well, that's the implications of that. And so there's a debate in the Liberal Party now about, did we go too far? And I'm glad that's happening.
Well, the scary thing about that would be that anybody in the Chinese community now who's saying, look, we should direct our votes this way, could be considered to be interfering under the new interference laws, the anti-interference law. And this is exactly what should people do in a community. Let's say there's a Jewish community, there's a Lebanese community, there's a Vietnamese community. Do people who lead that community guide their community to vote a certain way? And the moment you do that and are Chinese, then you've got a problem. If you do that, and let's say there's an American or a Australian Italian, Australian Maltese, Australian Greek community, they have community leaders. If that community leader directs their community and says, I think we should vote this way and this is why, is that foreign interference, or is that normal electioneering, politicking? And this seems to me that that's normal. But at the moment, if it's Chinese, wow, now you've got a problem.
You're right. They are the Chinese community is being singled out for doing what every other community does. And just the other day, I was having a discussion with someone who was describing to me how another community operates in Australia. And this is a community with an excellent reputation. They do a lot of charitable work. But this person was admiring how organized this community is so they can do this charitable work. I don't want to name them because I don't want to single them out just describing this, but they're very well organized. They do the charitable work, but they can also help out because they want to be helpful, and this was an ex-politician. He's saying, look, I just call them up and I say, look, because, his friends, it'd be good to have this done. And this community can just organize themselves and call their people and say, let's get this done, let's get that done. And he was admiring it. And I'm saying, as good as what your story is, all I can think is that if the government ever decided to target that community the way they're targeting China, everything you've just said can be twisted into something sinister.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the thing. You can say, that's interference. That's interference. It was an illustration of just what they've done to China. They've taken the same actions that every other community does, and twists it. And then people think, the Chinese are infiltrating every part of our society, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, let's move on to talk about this. There's two different personalities I was going to ask you about today. The two personalities who I've come into contact with quite regularly, to people, not personalities, two different people who are making big names for themselves in Australia for, I personally think, all the wrong reasons. And I'd like your opinion on these two people. One of them is Vicky Shu, who I know you've personally met. And I saw that there was a very interesting story where she accused you of stalking her when she actually met you. I mean, she collared you, or you found yourself in the same taxi line. Tell us about that.
So before I elaborate, I just want to say I do not criticize Vicky Shu for what she says and the particular outlook she has, right, and for being a Chinese dissident, because I'm not a Chinese person who grew up in China and moved to Australia. I don't have her experiences. That they're entirely hers. She can say what she likes, and I do not criticize her at all for that. But in her particular case, this was a woman who was being promoted in the media. There was a Four Corners story, which Four Corners is our premier a current affairs program, investigative journalism program. They did a whole episode on her as a comedian, a wannabe comedian, and someone who's a Chinese dissident, etc. But then she began to work for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and this is an organisation that I do criticise because it's Australian, or supposedly Australian. It takes money from foreign governments and weapons manufacturers, and it has hyped up the so-called danger of a war with China as the party that's trying to encourage the war, if anything, to incite
the threat of China is hyped up. Yeah,
China threat, right? It's hyped it up, and in doing so, I regard it as having zero credibility, except the way it's reported in the media in Australia and around the world. It is the source on this information in China. But our party has been looking at ASPI's claims going back as at least 2015, and we would look at its claims and say, what's the truth of those claims? And then just investigating them to the degree we were able to, we saw this is bogus. And one example is in 2016, we had a census that for the first time was online, the first online census in Australian history. And what happened? It failed. And it failed for all the normal reasons that getting the whole country to do one thing online one night would do, right? Someone hadn't turned on a router or something, it later emerged. But when it failed, ASPI, which is funded by the taxpayer, the leadership of ASPI went on the media hard saying, we've been hacked by China, we've been hacked by China, we've been hacked by China. And it's an example of the kinds of claims that they make, where some are more serious than others, but I know it's a Chinese expression, but I use it for this information. It's death of 1,000 cuts.
Yes.
Just all the little things and big things add up to the destruction of our relationship. But I pay attention to the little claims as well, because they're just constant and they're nagging. And this is a smaller than usual claim, but it was totally bogus, right? But it's what they do. So Vicky Shu is working for them, and I'm taking notice of the fact I see her on social media, and I'm taking notice of that fact that she's working for them. And she was in the orbit of the second person we'll talk about, Drew Pavlov, who I was having a fair amount of engagement with. And anyway, in 2020, she put out a report called Uyghurs for Sale. Our organisation looked at it. We had a researcher did an excellent article on it saying, look, you look at the references in this report, they do not say what she's claiming that says. So we had criticised that. And then I just happened to take a pot shot at her on Twitter because she made some comparison between the fact that her ex-boyfriend hadn't returned her goods, her stuff. And she's young. She's younger than me. She puts her personal life online. That's her business. But the language she used was similar to the language she used accusing China of genocide in Xinjiang.
Oh, right. Yes, I remember this.
I just said, look, your choice of words, this is undermining. You're making light of these kinds of accusations if you're prepared to use them in this personal context of spat between you and your boyfriend. So she replied to me saying, do a course in humor, you stupid old bald fuck. And you can beat that out if you want to. Anyway, and then she deleted that tweet, though. The tweet I criticized, she actually deleted it. So I don't know what that meant, but maybe she thought, well, it wasn't a good look, because I made my point. Probably 8 months later, I'm in a plane coming back from Canberra, and because I've been to Parliament for a hearing on a different subject. And I saw her on my plane, and she came down the aisle and she sat a few seats behind me. And so I recognized her straight away, and I'm thinking, well, I'm the guy she called that. But I would never talk to someone on a plane, especially if there's a chance it could get confrontational, because you're in an enclosed space, right? So I wouldn't do that. There was a journalist sitting in front of me, directly in the seat in front of me, who's one of the leading anti-China journalists in Australia. And if I had had a choice, I would have had a crack at him. But I still wouldn't do that in a plane. But I had noted, I was texting some friends of mine and two different people, and I said, oh, Vicky Shu's on my plane. Should I talk to her? And one of them said, yeah, of course. Say, after what she said to you, you should introduce yourself. And the other said, no, you shouldn't talk to her because she'll twist it into something against you. And as it turned out, Jerry, that was sound advice, because I didn't talk to her. I got off the plane, and now because I was seated first, I got off the plane before she did. I didn't even stop. I just got off the plane, walked out of the airport. I didn't have to wait for luggage. Walked straight to the taxi rank at the Melbourne airport. And I got there so quickly, I was there first. There was just me at the cab rank, and the cabs were down the Qantas end. And so all the cabs line up down the other end, and you have to wait for them to be called when there's people lining up for them. So I was the first there. It's just me. I'm waiting for my cab to drive up. And then Vicky Shu comes and stands beside the bay next to my cab bay, right? So we're about 3 meters or 4 meters apart. I didn't go any closer to her. It was literally just me and her. And I thought, well, I am going to say something. And I said, hi, I'm Robbie Barwick. Do you remember me? You called me a stupid old bald fuck. And she goes, oh yeah. So she did remember me. And then she was actually, I knew she was coming to Melbourne because it'd been promoted on TV. She was coming to Melbourne to go on a show called Q&A, where she was going to be talking about how she was a target of harassment by the Chinese community because of online harassment because of what she says about China. And they'd made a big deal about this. And I knew that what I'd done online wasn't harassment, but that's what people do on China, on Twitter. So you take, you can make pointed comments at each other, but I never get personal on Twitter, right? Anyway, I said to her, look, I'm sorry for what's happening to you, but do you know why people like me do what I do? Because I don't want a war with China. And she said straight away, I'm already at war with China. And I said, no, I'm in a real war with China. And she said, I'm in a real war with China. And then the cabs came, and I knew this conversation was going nowhere. I said, okay, good luck on Q&A. And I hopped in my cab and walked away and drove away. Now, that night, she went on Q&A. Her whole narrative was she was a target of harassment. She did not mention that incident that had happened to her that day at the airport. She didn't mention it.
Because there was no harassment there.
There was no harassment. And I was at my measured best. Voices weren't raised. I didn't approach her, anything like that, right? What I've just recounted was the conversation. And in fact, I tweeted about it that
I remember.
day. You can see my tweet, right? I tweeted about it, and I told the essence of the story. So that was my only engagement with Vicky Shu until 3 weeks ago or so. I went to Jack James, an Australian lawyer, has written an excellent report debunking Vicky Shu.
The Co-West Pro papers, everybody should read them, yeah.
Exactly, Pro, Jacqueline James report. And I took copies of that to a public event at La Trobe University that she was speaking at. And I went along because she was speaking at it, because I wanted the first opportunity to ask her a question about her report. And when I got up to do that, I was the first questioner. She straight away used the fact, she said, I know Robert, she made claims about my discussion with her at the airport where she said, in my opinion, he ambushed me and he's not asking in good faith. I refuse to answer. Now, Jerry, because of the way she chose to say, if she had just said, I refuse to answer without saying anything disparaging about me, I don't know what I would have said. But because she had misrepresented the exchange at the airport and said it, compared it to an ambush, etc., and misrepresented the tweet that She claimed I'd said things in the tweet that I didn't. I reacted, right? And then it got quite confronting at the event. And that was twisted. And then her comeback at me when I reacted was she called me a stalker. So she accused me of ambush and she called me a stalker. And subsequently, she's called me a stalker again on social media. Now, this is a crime. You're a former cop. Stalking is a crime. Right?
It wasn't when I was a cop. It's new.
It's one of those things. They made movies about it, etc., and then suddenly it becomes. What do they call it?
It became a crime because somebody famous in the UK got killed by a stalker. She'd been to the police. She was a newsreader, I think, quite an attractive lady, and someone was stalking her. She went to the police, and they said, "Well, he's not committing a crime." And he wasn't at that stage, and he stalked her, and the police kept saying, "There's nothing we can do. There's no law against what he's doing." And eventually she ended up murdered, and there had been a series of events where she told the police, who literally did their job and said, "There's not a thing that we can do about this person, and just take care." And unfortunately, sorry?
I think they're called fixated persons in the.
Not sure in the UK. It's new law after my time. So this happened while I was in Australia. This happened to this UK journalist while I was in Australia. Now they have very strict laws about it. Yeah, and that's a good thing. It's good. The problem is now if she reports you to the police, you become the fixated or the person of interest to the police, and you haven't actually done anything wrong, and that's a problem. You get into this register, and he's done something like this before. Oh, you haven't.
Well, it's lucky that my conversation with her. Sorry, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, it's lucky that my conversation with her was recorded on video, my second one.
Yes. Because
you can see they then made claims about that are also...
You approached her in a threatening manner.
Supposedly.
You moved 1 meter to your left, I think, and didn't move one step closer to her. I think that was what I saw anyway. And it is a legitimate question because many Uyghurs have been disadvantaged by this rhetoric around something which Jack James, interesting about the Coes Pro papers, and Jack and I have discussed this as well. The Coes Pro papers does not prove there is no forced labor. What the Coes Pro papers does is it proves that ASPI have not proven there is, quite categorically. And what it really needs is further investigation to prove, in my opinion, there is no forced labor. I know pretty much everything that goes on in the labor industry in China. I've been here working within it for 18 years. Education industry, business industry, manufacturing. Now I'm retired, but I'm traveling a lot. And so, I know that what ASPI put out is not correct. I know this about several different aspects of what they put out, not just the forced labor. But what Jack did was she proved without a shadow of a doubt, in a legal sense, that their evidence would not stand scrutiny. That's what she did. She's proven that they have not proven it does exist. So that's not the same as it doesn't exist. There's still more work to be done. And
I think that's why Vicky Shu and her associates are trying to twist my actions because they're trying to change the subject of her report into somehow what my behavior was. And lucky, like I said, there was a video and people can see the evidence for themselves. Because it is, I just have to stand by that. And we'll see. I'm seeking legal advice on the accusations that she's made against me and that some people in the media have amplified those same accusations and used the same terminology. Okay. We'll see where I'm just seeking advice at the moment. We'll see where that goes.
Well, let's move on and talk about the other party that I was interested in. And some people thought this was real. I saw a tweet that said that Vicky had got married to Drew Pavlov. And we know that's not, well, maybe it's not true. Nobody's proven that it hasn't happened yet. So by the same logic, Vicky and Drew are now married until proven otherwise. But of course, it was taken by quite a lot of people on Twitter as the real thing. And I've actually had people say to me, "Did you know about this?" No, it was just a joke. Somebody put out this tweet. What do you think about Drew Pavlov? And does he have any point to what he's doing?
No, there was a side to me that for a while thought, I've got to hand it to Drew. He's a true believer in his cause and he's fearless, etc. And you admire that even if you don't agree with what he's.
Yeah, I've had that conversation with him too.
Right. Mm-hmm. So that used to be. I actually did feel that for a while. Frankly, I've completely tired of him because one of the things that Drew Pavlov likes to do is say, many people do it. He weaponizes it. He says, "I don't hate the Chinese people. I hate the CCP." And it's all about Xi Jinping personally, except every now and then the mask slips. So the other day, for instance, he replied to a tweet where someone had said that China doesn't have a history of invading people on lies. And his reply was, "This person is ignoring thousands of years of Chinese history." And of course, by highlighting that, well, there's only 70 years of Chinese history that's been under the Communist Party. Yeah. The rest of it is he was actually disparaging the Chinese people based on his own version of history, which is totally bogus. Like I don't know where he learned his history from, but it's if he can't acknowledge some basic facts like the remarkable lack of aggression China has shown throughout its history, especially compared to the European parts of the world. Anyway, it just proved to me, no, he's buying into a very anti-China xenophobic worldview, and that's the older he gets, because he started off young. He was 19 when he first started being an anti-China activist. The older he gets, the less forgivable that is.
Yes.
He came to my attention when he organised a protest at the University of Queensland in 2019 over Hong Kong. What he also specialised in is playing the victim.
Yeah.
So he sets up these scenarios where he incites a lot of rage beforehand, as he did at that event. I know he did. People who were there informed me that he did. I've had lots of people in the University of Queensland saying, "You got no idea what this guy was like." He would incite all this rage, and when he gets the reaction that he wants, the slightest touch on him is a brutal assault. I've been brutally assaulted, right? Mm-hmm. And he plays the victim. I just find it, as someone who also got involved in politics when I was 18, I've been in politics, so I was young and had all the fervor, and I'd like to think, I still have the fervor. You just sort of, you get wiser about certain things as you get older. It just beggars belief that this guy, he acts like he's some kind of groundbreaking revolutionary, Jerry, except every cause he takes up is approved by the United States government.
Oh,
right.
Is there an allegation in that?
Well,
just a coincidence.
The allegation is his sense of morality is to be approved. He's the most unradical person in history.
Right.
If all his causes are those approved by the greatest power in the world today, which has 800 military bases around the world, thinks it can go and apply its justice on every country, what it considers justice in every country in the world, and I'm talking about Julian Assange, etc. His causes are approved by that. He would like to think he's the greatest friend of Islamic victims, the Islamic people that are victims of oppressive governments that ever existed. Yeah. Well, I never hear him talk about Palestine.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. Does he have any Lebanese or Palestinian friends? He has a few Tibetans and a few Uyghurs who are the diaspora who living in Australia. But I've never heard him talk to a Vietnamese person who came from Vietnam as a boat victim, a boat person in the 70s and 80s. I've never heard him talking about a Lebanese person who was bombed to death or bombed to pieces in Beirut. All of these patterns seem to follow. You're right. The talking points of the American government. Now, people accuse me of following the talking points of the Chinese government, and my answer to that is, what's wrong with them? And there is nothing wrong with the talking points of the Chinese. I'm parroting Chinese propaganda. Well, no, I'm actually not parroting anything. I do my own research. I make my own observations, and this is what comes out. Now, do you think he might not be doing just the same thing? He truly believes what he stands for?
Well, I tend to think he does truly believe what he stands for. I just think he has a personality type that is easily manipulated. So I've taken to comparing him to the Warner Brothers Tassie Devil of human rights politics. He even complains that he has all his friends in Parliament who applaud every stunt he does.
Yeah,
but they won't let him join their parties. They won't let him. He had to start his own party because they won't let him run for Parliament for them. They praise him. They praise him, but they don't want to work with him personally. Why? Because they know he's a destructive personality. He's such a narcissist. He's impossible to work with. And
do you have an example of a parliamentarian who's actually supported him? Because I wasn't aware of that. This is new to me, that someone in Parliament has said this guy's good or given him some sort of support.
Senator James Paterson is the most prominent one I can think of. The late Senator Kimberly Kitching, she died a few months ago, was also very prominent. But Senator James Paterson promotes Drew's antics as much as he can. There was another senator, Eric Abetz, who got voted out at the last election. Yeah. He's the senator who forced 3 Chinese people to denounce the Chinese Communist Party before they testified in Parliament, or tried to, and there was a big blow up about that.
It wasn't one of them half Vietnamese, not even Chinese origin, I think.
Oh yeah, it doesn't. Well, that's the nature of xenophobia. That's and
they're all Asian.
They all look the same, right? And the ignorance, and a lot of Vietnamese and Filipinos and others have been targeted just because they look Asian by people who are anti-China. But no, Senator James Paterson is the most prominent one who really does promote Drew's antics, except they won't let him join. They will not let him join their parties, and they're just using his destructive nature to generate publicity. And I think it's very, very unfortunate because there's been a real operation to take claims like the essence of his claim, Jerry, is that because of his experience at the University of Queensland, which is one of the biggest universities in Australia, his experience proves that somehow Xi Jinping personally controls the University of Queensland.
Right.
Yeah. And then when he went to London, though, and this is something you'd know a bit about, he is the subject of understandable law enforcement by the British police, the Metropolitan Police. And what does he do? He says that means the Chinese Communist Party somehow control the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah, the Chinese Party have infiltrated the Metropolitan Police and caused them. Now, I actually did a video about that. If anybody wants to watch that, I said, "Will Drew go to prison? Is Drew Pavlov going to prison?" Something like that. The video was called, and the idea was exactly that, to just kind of point out what his options were, why what happened to him on a legal basis, because I actually did work in the diplomatic protection group for a couple of years. So I know exactly what would have happened had somebody come to an embassy I was monitoring, because we stand outside embassies. We're basically armed security guards outside of embassies. And I would have acted the same way. First of all, you'd tell the guy to get lost, get out of here. You're only going to get arrested if you do that stupid thing. And they only get arrested, in my day anyway, they would only have got arrested if they were idiots, if they were stupid about something. And it seems that he might have been a little bit stupid about something. So
is it also, I had a hypothesis that maybe you can confirm, but embassies in London especially have been targets of terrorist attacks over the years. They're quite famous ones. And I can't think of another city that's probably had the same level of attention in that way that London has had. And so it's understandable that the London police are extra sensitive to any potential threat. And while Drew denies the threat, and that's got to be proven in court, etc., but it's natural for the Metropolitan Police to act the way they did. It's 100% understandable. Yet, because of his view, because of the way he sees himself and sees the world, he just thinks he can lash out and accuse them of being controlled by the Communist Party of China.
He feels victimized. He is the victim in this. I mean, this is a guy who admits going equipped to the embassy to commit criminal damage. There in itself is an offense. He admitted that he took super glue and posters and planned to put stuff on the embassy gates. Criminal offense, criminal damage. So there you go. There's no victimization there. He admitted that on Twitter. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go there and I'm going to do this. In fact, I think he said afterwards, I admitted I was going to do this. I had the super glue and the posters. He didn't say he was going to do that at that time. But he also, if a bomb threat was made, and it doesn't matter who made that bomb threat, the police are obliged to investigate. Now, London has seen terrorist bombs, quite a few of them. Britain has seen terrorist bombs, and in recent times too. Yeah. And they're very, very conscious. If there's a bomb threat, it has to be treated seriously. If there's a bomb threat with someone's name on it, someone who is vehemently anti-China, then that must also be treated seriously. Now, honestly, do I think he made that bomb threat? No, I don't think he did. Even Drew's quite a smart young man, and I've told him this. He's an intelligent man who is misled. Or is an intelligent man who sees an opportunity, because he's making a lot of money doing this. This is another thing. He's crowdfunded, that I'm aware of, in the last 2 years, more than 120,000 Australian dollars. He had 60,000 for his campaign to get elected, and he had 67,000 on a variety of different crowdfunding sites and crowdfunding appeals, on one site in particular. And so I did a little research and I found these things, and it's quite clear that he's raising a lot of money. So, yeah, this is a guy who's raising a lot of money. How do you raise money? By being a victim. How do you become a victim? By doing something stupid and then being victimized as a result of it. So some people have said to me, yeah, he may be totally stupid to have done that, but isn't it the sort of thing he would have done? And the answer to that is, I don't know if he's that stupid. Because if he did do that, he's going to court, he's going to prison for 7 years, or up to 7 years, to make a bomb threat against an embassy, against anywhere, but to make a bomb threat against an embassy that you have deliberately targeted yourself. You've targeted yourself and you've targeted the Chinese people. Now you're targeting a Chinese embassy, and there's a bomb threat in your name. If he did that, he's not getting away with that without going into prison. And that was the basis of my last video, or not last video, the video I did about that. He's left England now, so he's not facing court. Now, if this is a very minor offense, he'll go back and face the court, and he'll get a slap on the wrist, perhaps a fine, some kind of good behavior bond, and that will be the end of the matter, and everything moves on. But if he made that call, if he did that, send that bomb threat, then he's not going back to face court, because he will go to prison for that. And I think that's the thing. And when he doesn't appear in court, that's when we find out what he was charged with. Now, in all honesty, if he was charged with making that bomb threat, it doesn't mean he did do it. It means the police have very good evidence to suggest that he did it, and they're going to put that evidence before the court. And if he did do it, he's going to prison. So he's innocent until proven guilty. He's not guilty at this stage at all for anything, but he has actually admitted going equipped to commit criminal damage on Twitter. So he's going to court for that, at least. So he has been bailed to a court date and he's left the country. It'll be interesting to see how that develops.
He's been invited back to address the Oxford Union, which he claims he's going to. But I too would... I'd find it difficult to believe that he actually did send the threat. However, my only position is that the actions of the Metropolitan Police are entirely justified. And I just think people need to look at the accusations that he's prepared to make in that regard, which are very similar to the accusations he's prepared to make in everything else related to China, and they have just as little credibility. And so, but, you know, take into account that the people who cheer him on won't work with him in person, won't let him in the organisations. And I hope he's unless he gets more sensible as he gets older, then the Drew Pavlov phenomenon has its day very soon.
I think so. Okay, one last question now. This we've got to just over an hour now, and I wanted to keep this about an hour, so it's not too long. But one last question. China and Australia have their issues. China and Australia have their problems right now. Is it up to China, or is it up to Australia to take the next step to fix these problems? And what do you, as a politician or a political party member in Australia, think that next step ought to be?
Well, you might have seen a photo I tweeted about a very good dinner I had last week with the Chinese ambassador to Australia, Mr. Xiao. So last Monday night I had dinner with the Chinese ambassador, and it came about because a former assistant foreign minister of New Zealand, Matt Robson, was in Australia as my guest of our party for other things we were doing. But Matt has a real concern about these geopolitical issues as well in relation to his country. And frankly, there's more of a debate in his country. And so he was coming to Canberra with me, and we took the opportunity to ask for a meeting and actually Matt met some other embassies while he was in Canberra as well. And in the case of the Chinese ambassador, they invited us to dinner. So we got to talk about this very thing at dinner with the ambassador. Now, I went into that dinner with my own views, and they haven't changed. My own views in relation to your question. And that's simply this. I think the ball's in Australia's court. It's not in China's court. China didn't change the relationship, despite what our Prime Minister has said. Mr. Albanese has said repeatedly during the election and after the election, China changed, Australia didn't change. Well, I think that's a great big pile of garbage. China did not change. There are some things that China has done in reaction to geopolitical moves that Australia has been involved in. The biggest of those being the 2011 so-called pivot to Asia by the United States government, Obama, where for the first time ever, Marines were stationed in Darwin, right? And the Marines in Darwin are there to be a potential offensive weapon in the Asia Pacific if they're ever needed. They're called the tip of the spear. And so they can do things like they have the capacity to do things, for instance, such as shut down the Malacca Straits, through which flows a lot of oil that a country like China is very dependent on. So that was in 2011. Xi Jinping wasn't the president then. In 2013, China started building up the islands in the South China Sea, but then so did other countries. Taiwan builds up islands in the South China Sea. The Vietnamese do, etc. So China is accused of the building up of the islands as an offensive projection of force, when in truth, the reaction, at worst, it's a reaction to what our side did first. And the second big one coincided with the Trump administration, even though the changes had started under Obama. And even though I do believe Trump's language was mainly rhetoric, he personally wanted to get a deal with China, get better trade terms, pretty much blackmail China into doing that, which China agreed to, and Trump was happy with the deal. However, he employed people who had a long-standing agenda, such as real neoconservatives, John Bolton and others in the White House, Mike Pompeo, who are absolute art xenophobes, and our country went along with them. We started towing the line with their rhetoric. And there was a very important article published last year by a veteran journalist review. His name is Max Such. And he pointed out, Jerry, that in 2017, the Department of Foreign Affairs gave a briefing at the Lowy Institute where they foreshadowed that Australia was going to run into trade difficulty with China. This is 2017. The trade difficulty started in 2020. They foreshadowed that because they said, we are going to align with the United States in this tension with China, and to the point where eventually our trade will suffer. So in 2020, when Australia started lashing out and blaming China for the coronavirus, etc., and there was a trade reaction by China, the way it was reported, the way the government acted, and the way the media reported, oh, look how terrible these Chinese are. They're using trade coercion against us. no, this briefing proves, this briefing 3 years earlier proved that Australia knew that its actions were going to lead to that and were deliberately taking the actions that would lead to that. So we did change. China didn't change. We did change. Now,
those briefings also failed to mention the 160, I think it was, World Trade Organization breaches that were being discussed that Australia had done to China before those 4 items. And we're talking about the coal, the lobsters.
106.
Yeah, 106
by Australia against China. And then China responded with 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right? Okay. No, that's right.
What's the next step, Robbie? What should, if you were the Prime Minister, what would you do?
Well, I would look at America's standing in the world and realize we've tied ourselves to a sinking ship. We should stop doing that. We don't have to cut ties with America, but we must become more independent of America, 1. And we have to assert that independence. 2, we should use our special relationship, which we do have with America, to actually argue common sense to the Americans, saying what you're doing is destructive. We are your best ally. We think what you are doing is destructive to you and to the world, and we're not with you. And I'll tell you this, Jerry, the reason why at the time of the Iraq War, the Americans like quoting Tony Blair and like quoting John Howard to justify that decision is because it looks good. They've got allies that are good, like the good old Aussies, the Brits, they're with us. What if the Aussies weren't with them for once? And the American politicians had to explain, hang on, our good old Aussie allies aren't with us on this. And then there are thinking people in America who are much more reasonable, who that would strengthen their hand, and they can say that they get stronger in the debate and say, see, we should stop doing this. We must learn to coexist with these rising powers like China, not go down a path that will inevitably lead to war. And that's one role we can play in the diplomatic sphere. And then I think we just need to look at the bottom line. We have such immense benefit from our trade with China. Our surplus in 2019, Jerry, was 78 billion. That was in 2019. Do you know what our surplus is today with China? $120 billion. We have a like, it's so big. It's not only is China our biggest trading partner, it's all in our favor, like I said earlier. And the Chinese are happy to do that. The Chinese want to do business with us. They want to advance the relationship. They would like to cooperate on economic development. You know, the Chinese ambassador was talking about how Australia could be making electric cars here, which would benefit us domestically. They could help us. They could help us with expertise on high-speed rail construction. You know, there's always been this talk in Australia about it. It's never gone anywhere. The Chinese are the world's expert in it. We could do these sort of things and put our relationship on a very cooperative footing. And the best thing about China is it's the country that is the most sensitive to other countries' sovereignty because it's so sensitive about its own. Correct. And when you do these deals with China, you're not being expected to give up your sovereignty. They're willing to do the deal with you on your terms, and they expect you when you go to China to do the deals with them on their terms. Right?
That's become obvious because they're dealing with Saudi Arabia without any problems, any issues. They're saying whatever happens there, that's between Saudi Arabians and their government. And they're dealing with Cambodia is a great example. They helped Cambodia an awful lot. They're in Burma, Myanmar as well, doing the same thing. Everywhere they go, they're just doing whatever, all through Africa and now South America. And of course, that's all seen as a threat. It's all the big threat. The only threat is to the United States. It's not their national security, it's their national interest. And that's a very different thing to national security. There is no threat to American security. There's a threat to interests in America is the way I see it. We should really think about winding up here because we're into an hour and a quarter now. I just want to finish off with one thing. Where do people find you? And what I was thinking was this. There are, in my follower base, a hell of a lot of Australian Chinese people. What can they do to help? This is a rounding off question. The Chinese Australian people, could they follow you? Can they help you? Can you help them in any way? Because I think there's some symbiotic relationship there where you and they can help each other. They really need a voice, and they need that voice to be an Australian voice rather than a Chinese voice because of the foreign influence laws. Can they and can you help them without getting into any trouble?
Oh, well, I think what I would say to them is, you're Australian citizens. You have all the rights of Australian citizens. Don't let some of these people with agendas tell you otherwise. So the ones that used their right to vote in the last election were very effective and good on them, and they should. And it did get the right attention, and it got some negative stuff, as we talked about. People are trying to cast suspicion on that, but not as much as I would have thought, right? Most people are realizing, oh boy, this has gone too far. But I will say to the Australian Chinese people and people who are concerned about this, take note that our party is the only party that's pushing back against this as forcefully as we are. Because we are, Jerry, we've had people in the Australian Chinese community approach us and open a dialogue, and some of them said, well, I'm interested in politics. I'd given up. I'm going to join your party, and everyone's welcome to do it. You're allowed to join a political party. You're allowed to join our party, become a member, get a subscription to our magazine, participate in party activities like every other Australian citizen can. Funnily enough, we have a very, very, very tiny percentage of super tiny, below 1% of our membership would be Australian Chinese, because we've never done this to pander to the community or anything. We've never done this for votes. We've done this because we consider ourselves patriotic Australians. We don't want to end up in a war. But if Australian Chinese want to support that, please do. So you can go to our website, www.citizensparty.org.au. You can call our toll-free number, 1-800-636-432, and someone will talk to you.
Can you send that to me, and I'll link it in the description?
Absolutely. I'll send you those things. People, feel free to get in touch with us and open discussion. You can invite us to it. If you want us to speak at your events, etc., you're welcome to do that. More than happy to engage with everybody.
Okay, so a quick word from our sponsors. Thank you. And I think we should wrap it up there. We said about an hour, nearly an hour and 20, but it's really been great talking to you. You're so insightful. Thank you very much. I learn a lot about my own country from you.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks for being the right person in the right place in the right time in China, because seeing China through your eyes has benefited me immensely. My father was a prison officer, and I think it might have helped me relate to you that way as well, because of your experience in those areas.
We do have a lot in common, yeah.
And it's been really important, because Australians, the worst part of this whole thing is Australians do not want to hear what China. They do not think Chinese voices are credible, and that's terrible, because Chinese voices are credible, but too many people don't think that. So having you there was very beneficial for me and my understanding of what's been going on.
Okay. Well, I'm still here, and I'm in Beijing now. I've been doing a lot of traveling recently. I came up here yesterday to do an opening of a new program by Xinhua, which is basically telling small stories to show the big experience. And that's the future of the way that they're going. And I'd written an article about Chinese democracy, and they asked me to turn it into a 5-minute TED Talk kind of thing. So they invited me up here, and I'm in the Hilton Hotel, and I'm being very well looked after, but they don't pay me, unfortunately. But they do look after me, and this has been great for me. The traveling around gives me the eye-opening opportunities. It gets me to talk to different people. And if you have any issues that something about China that you need to ask, then by all means ask. If I can answer, I will. If I can't, I'll try and find someone here who can. And I think we should keep this dialogue open now that we've started it. We started it with you interviewing me more than a year ago now. And when I was like 4,000, 5,000 followers on my Twitter. Wow, things have changed a little bit with my exposure.
You've done well.
Yeah, I still don't believe what's happened in terms of how that's grown. It's amazing, really, really amazing. But we'll get there. And thank you very much for everything that you're putting together in Australia and keeping Australia great. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek.
All right. So we're going to say goodbye. We've actually got 60 viewers here as well. So it's been quite popular. I was surprised because I didn't advertise this as going live. It just happened. And so dynamically, we've built up 60 viewers. So thank you, everybody, for watching too. All right. So goodbye
Thanks,
to
Jerry.
everyone. I'm going to end the broadcast and talk to you again soon.